So we'll get underway here. This is Lent, and so what I thought we would do for these weeks coming up to Easter is to look at the stories in the New Testament, in the Gospels, in the four Gospels of the last days of Jesus, which would be uh, the Last Supper, really the betrayal, the Last Supper, the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, and the resurrection in the way the gospel stories unfold. Um, so it's a beautiful, fascinating approach to all of this. Uh, the several pieces of this that I find especially fascinating uh, and informative also. Uh, I sort of put dates together. I've discovered in these years how important dates are to try to understand the flow of the New Testament, of Old and New Testament stories in there. So you get them, if you're not careful, you get them all mixed up, and it don't work out real well. But so I I have Jesus born about 4 BC. That's, I mean, not just me, but that's pretty well prevailing scholarship that Jesus was born in about 4 BCE, before the Common Era. He was born. Pretty good scholarship as King Herod was dying, Jesus was born somewhere along in there. Uh, the Matthew and Luke have Jesus born in Bethlehem, which is okay. Probably that is put there to make a theological and biblical point. More likely, Jesus was born and grew up in Nazareth. That's sort of the prevailing scholarship, that he really was from Nazareth and not Bethlehem. Because from his whole from antiquity, he is known as Jesus of Nazareth. So grew up there in Nazareth. Uh, but for sure, he spent his career, his ministry, forever how long that was, in Nazareth, in the Galilean villages up and through there. Uh, he so he was a Galilean. Galilee is north. If you've been up through there, north of in the northern part of the country, of the real small country of what we call today Israel, the northern part, a real fertile part, uh, kind of a breadbasket from what you read, but also a place of a lot of resistance to the Romans and to the prevailing temple system. Part of what Mark wants to do is to get his people emotionally prepared, emotionally equipped to find ways to resist their oppressors. And there were two main oppressors in the time of Jesus. And one was the temple system, which had evolved and developed over a long period of time, had become very oppressive, taken vast amounts of money and produce from the people. So they were spending vast amounts of money out of their own poverty to keep the temple system going. Come in, come in. Uh, and he was resisting that. Jesus resisted that. He thought it was not just, and so he was resisting that. And the other that Mark does not talk much about, of course he couldn't afford to, is the Roman Empire. And the real villain of the time was the Roman Empire. Roman was the Roman army. Over those centuries, the city of Rome had become the Roman Empire and had taken over that whole huge Mediterranean base. So, and they were very oppressive. They stole land. They were brutal. They killed people. Uh, and so Mark, that was the main villain. Though it's interesting, Mark does not talk about that because he couldn't. You know, you can't you can't fight them. They were too mean. But anyway, so Jesus started a ministry in the Galilee, in the villages, and that looks pretty good from the New Testament. Uh, Along the way, Jesus met up with John the Baptist. That's pretty clear. And in the Gospel of Luke, uh, Jesus and John are distant cousins. This is uh, that's a little part in the second chapter of Luke that they were distant cousins. So whether that is true or not, I think it's pretty clear that at a point Jesus connected with John the Baptizer, John the Baptist. John preached up and down the Jordan River and baptized up and down the Jordan River. I think it's clear. I mean, it's good evidence that John baptized Jesus. Uh, uh, I mean, the New Testament says that, but that's a pretty good piece of history that one can put together and one can surmise that there was a close connection there between John and Jesus. It's also hinted at in the Gospels in various kinds of ways that at a point, Jesus pulled away from John the Baptist and started his own ministry. John up and down the Jordan, but Jesus settling up, focusing his ministry in the small towns up in the northern part of the country there in Galilee, in the small villages. So the two contrasts there between John and Jesus. Uh, we don't know how long the ministry of Jesus lasted. If you read the book of Mark, it could be 1 year. Uh, I hunch that it was 4 or 5 years, but it did not last long. Apparently, it just did not last long. Uh, but he attracted followers. You read the New Testament along the way, you could get the idea that he attracted huge crowds of followers. I think that is kind of suspicious because the Roman army would not allow big crowds to gather. The stories in most of the Gospels, if not all of them, that he fed the 5,000. He probably fed some people, but he didn't do 5,000 because Rome would never have allowed, the Roman army would never have allowed 5,000 people to gather around one charismatic figure. That's me extrapolating, from the gospel. But anyway, I'm just saying that. Uh, and the New Testament does that kind of thing. Along the way, in ways that are not really clear, Jesus got in trouble. Uh, a lot of his parables and teachings were countercultural. Uh, that is another whole study we won't get into, but he rankled the powers that be, and he especially began, as he in the book of Marcus, he began to focus on the oppression of the temple system. He rapidly got in trouble with the temple authorities. I always want to make the point that the Jews did not kill Jesus. The temple authorities, who were Jewish in ways that are kind of hinted at or pointed toward in the Gospels, the Jewish authorities colluded with the Roman army to get rid of Jesus, which they did regularly with anybody that caused any trouble. Be done with them. They're a bother. What's one more? You they get rid of them. So that's kind of the milieu there. There are many. There's 1,000 other stories down in there that could be told of all of that. Uh, which is to say, the Gospels, as treasured as they are not history. They are faith statements. These are the stories of people who were deeply in love with, affected by, blessed by, touched by Jesus. Uh, so, in that sense, they are. It's not pure history. History is never pure. History is written by somebody with an agenda always. But the Gospels are faith statements. These are statements of love and adoration and appreciation. They also they emerged some years after Jesus. Uh, if Jesus died in 30, if the crucifixion happened in 30, which is just sort of a figure that I can pluck, the first gospel, Mark, did not come, did he? So nearly 40 years after whatever happened that we're looking at, 40 years had elapsed. So uh, that gives pause about what really was going on. Uh, and we don't know who wrote the Gospels. We have Mark, Matthew, John, and Luke, but nobody knows who they were. They along the way, second or third century, the Pope or some bishop gave them names, named the four Gospels. The four Gospels by the late second century were pretty much moving around through the little Jesus groups that were forming. Uh, so they were reading these, but they didn't know who wrote them. And uh, they were written for different reasons. The four Gospels were written to each to a specific community. So Mark, Matthew, all these others had an idea to whom they were writing. So that part of it. So that kind of gets to it there. And so what do we have in the Gospels then? A lot of we have a couple of things that I find real helpful. We have memories of memories. By the time Mark wrote, if his thing came out in 70, he would have been working on it for a while. It's not like he just cranked up the word processor and it came out overnight. So 35 or 40 years after whatever happened to Jesus, Mark writes. So a lot of stuff is happening in there. Real fascinating. And how the Jesus movement. So you got this part of it, and the other two or three other really interesting pieces about all of this. All four, really five gospels that we're looking at, were written from the standpoint of the last days of Jesus. Uh, the what most scholars call the Passion of Jesus, the Passion of Christ, is really the starting point, not the finishing point, but the starting point of the Gospels, because these writers of the story recognize big thing of Paul here. We can, it's fascinating to do that. But the death of Jesus, and so he died 30, whenever it was, and then as the movement began to develop, and I think it took hold pretty quickly in bits and pieces, but it took hold in ways that's fascinating to try to extrapolate. Uh, who was this Jesus? What did he do? And why is his death important? And, why do we pay attention to that? And so, in ways that scholars spend years and years and years trying to put together, they sort of piece together the ministry that Jesus involved: teaching, preaching, healing. He was some kind of healer. He was also totally committed to justice. He was for the poor, the marginalized. He was against the oppressors. So his thing was justice, compassion, justice, and he picked up the drift of that from the great Hebrew prophets, Amos, Hosea, all of these ancient from the 8th century BCE were people of justice. Okay, so what caused his death? A lot of speculation. Uh, Part of it could have been that by the time he began to gain some traction, some of his friends were calling him the Son of God. Now, in Mark, he's called the Son of Man, but others called him the Son of God, uh, which was treason. Only the Roman emperor, whoever he might be, Augustus, Tiberius, Claudius, whoever it was, only the Son of God. Uh, and then also the Gospels echo, not in Mark, but in others, that some of his friends began to call him the King of the Jews. And there could be only one king in the Roman Empire, and that was the emperor. So the Roman army was always ready to pounce on any whisper of treason. And so you got that ball rolling. And then I think that the episode that the Gospels all recount of Jesus turning stuff in the temple, he attacked the temple. The temple had become the major economic engine for the country, not of the poor, but of the wealthy. The wealthy, they accumulated vast amounts of treasure and they kept it for themselves, and the people from whom they collected it got no benefit of it at all. And so Jesus complained about that, attacked that, and so that was enough to get the temple authorities worked out. So all of that come together to say he got in a lot of trouble. He got in a lot of trouble. Uh, Now, the Gospels won't portray that trouble as something that was a big deal in the country there. I sort of think that it was not a big deal. I don't think that Jesus was that well known uh, in his life, partly because the Roman Empire would not let anybody get too famous. If you colluded with the Romans, you could get along, and that's what the temple people did. But the rest of you, empire. So anyway, that's aside. But the bottom line is that Jesus was crucified. He was born and he was crucified. I don't think there's any serious doubt about that. And then what happened in and of that time of crucifixion is what these gospels talk about. Okay? Uh, so now, and we have the four gospels. I think in the better order is Mark, Matthew, John, and Luke, rather than Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I think chronologically it works better in what I've studied and picked up for for Mark. Mark is the oldest, the earliest, and then Matthew, and then Luke and John. You can go back and forth, but I sort of think it's John and then Luke late. But anyway, that's fun. That's just an interesting piece. But now we have those four, but then intruding into all of that is the document, a very fragmentary document called the Gospel of Peter. Uh, Long about 130 or 40, 50, somewhere along in there in those early days, in the early stage of the Jesus movement, a man named, I forget, maybe Eusebius, one of these early church fathers, mentions the Gospel of Peter. He talks about it and he immediately labels it heresy. You know, history is written by the winners, and a group of bishops had become the winners as the Jesus movement developed. And in various kinds of ways, these bishops, with their own wisdom, could decide what was heresy and what was not. Uh, and they came down very heavy on anything with which they disagreed. Uh, and then whatever we will look at whatever the Gospel of Peter was, but whoever spoke about it, 150 whatever the early year was, uh, said it's heresy. It doesn't match up because by then these other Gospels were emerging. So you got the four that the people were pretty well agreed on, and then you have this interloper Gospel of Peter coming along, and it doesn't match, though it's a substantive story particularly of the trial and death and resurrection of Jesus. But we'll look at that in a minute. But they called it heresy, and then it disappeared. The papers itself, the papyrus on which it was written, disappeared uh, for about 1,800 years. As the people who were writing in those days, and there was a huge amount of writing going on, uh, would reference the Gospel of Peter, but pretty soon the document itself no longer existed. It was gone. And then I think it was in 1896, I think that's the date I've got here. Archaeologists were digging around in Egypt. Egypt has been a treasure trove of these ancient documents because of the climate, the very, very dry climate of Egypt enabled a lot of these documents to be preserved. In the dry climate of Egypt, they could be preserved. A lot of very important stuff was happening there. 1896, somewhere along in that late part of the 19th century, a group of archaeologists were digging around in a cemetery in Egypt. Eons had belonged to a monastery, and they were digging in the graves. I don't know all that stuff, but they were digging in the graves, and they uncovered the grave of a monk who had been probably buried about 800 or 900 Common Era. So he had been buried a very, very, very long time. And they dug up his grave, just uncovered it, and lo and behold, in his grave of this unknown monk, they found fragments, papyrus fragments, written in Greek. Uh, and so they were fortunate enough to save these fragments. And this is the whole printout of it right here. Not much of it was still saved, but the people who can read that kind of stuff began to read it. And early in the 20th century, the scholars were saying that this is the Gospel of Peter, referenced 1,800 years ago, but lost as far as anybody knew for all of those many, 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 many centuries. And they uncovered these fragments. And then poking around in that same area, it's another fascinating story. They found other little bitty pieces. And so from these few fragments, by the middle of the 20th century, the Gospel of Peter, what was left of it, just pieces of it, the scholars, the guys who could do this stuff, and men and women I admire greatly, could read that ancient Greek. Greek is primarily written without punctuation and without a word break. So it just bum, bum. It reads from left to right like we do. Hebrew, reads right to left. Greek reads left to right. But they read that stuff. I couldn't begin to do it, but they could read it. And then they begin to translate it, and it goes through all of the vetting and on and on and on of scholarship. Finally, it was agreed in the late 20th century and in the early 20s, and 150, something like that, but was even older than that. So somebody in 150 had a copy of it. He didn't like it. He called it heresy. The copy he had was old already. So then two of the great biblical scholars of the time, Dr. Raymond Brown and Dr. Dominic Crossan, both agreed that what they had found was Scott, he was a Jesuit priest, but one of the eminent, really eminent scholars. He dated the Gospel of Peter in the early second century, 110, 150s. Crossan made the startling announcement that the Gospel of Peter goes back to about 40. And if that is true, then that means that the Gospel of Peter predates the Gospel of Mark by 15 or 20 years, which gives it even more credibility. Okay. So the Gospel of Peter, uh, fascinating story. Uh, Dominic Crossan has a book, The Cross That Spoke. Uh, and if you want to take 4 or 5 years to read this, you're welcome to. But he breaks it down phrase by phrase, word by word, far on what I can do. But it is fact, and along the way in the story, in the translation, it looks like they have the phrase there that the cross, a word comes from the cross of Jesus. And so that's where Crossan gets his idea, the cross that spoke. Uh, we don't have time and we don't want to through all of that. I'd be glad to give you a copy of it. Uh, but several pieces of that are different. I mean, a lot of it is different. He starts out and not wash their hands. The Jews were scrupulous in washing their hands. So for some reason, the Jews did not wash their hands. So that was offensive to whoever was writing the Gospel of Peter. Uh, Several pieces of that are controversial. Uh, One is that it is that Pilate Pilate comes out looking pretty good in this, which makes it, they made it look like Pilate was a friend. Uh, and in the Gospels, it is finally Pilate who condemns Jesus to the cross. In the Gospel of Peter, it is Herod Antipas who is the governor, the royal governor, really son of Herod, who condemns Jesus to die. Take him away in this. That Herod Antipas, the governor, the tetrarch, and Pilate were good buddies. History does not bear that out at all. They despised each other. Pilate was a hard-headed, mean governor. Herod Antipas was the governor of the Galilee where Jesus grew up, and he he was not a good guy, but he was not as mean as some of those guys were. But anyway, so that's a conflict there. Um, and so Herod Antipas, the governor, is the one that condemns Jesus to die. Uh, the other parts of this are similar to what the Gospels have. Uh, all five of the Gospels, all four in the fifth here, have have men in white, men in white showing up from time to time in the scene. One of the interesting parts in the book of Mark, when Jesus is arrested in the garden, uh, Mark says 6 100 imperial soldiers came to arrest Jesus. At 600. Mark uses hullabaloo. Uh, but that probably is one of those stretches in there. Uh, Another piece that's intriguing in the Gospel of Mark, there is a young man in Mark's Gospel of the this young man is at the arrest of Jesus, uh, and in the hustle, his shirt is yanked away from him, and so he's in there in the arrest. He's naked, and he runs away naked. This is in the Gospel of Mark. And then on down the line, when the women and others begin to look in the tomb, there's a young man in white tomb in the tomb. Uh, a lot of speculation who they were, what they were up to. Uh, you could do all kinds of fiction writing about the young man in white who showed up at the arrest. He was not known as a disciple, but anyway, those little pieces there. Uh, and then Jesus dies, and the Gospel of Peter goes through a bit more elaborate story of how he is buried. It does sit with uh, in one of the other Gospels. I should have looked this up. Joseph of Arimathea emerges, and he pleads with Pilate to let him have the body of Jesus to bury. Typically, when the Romans executed somebody, they left the body on the cross. They would not allow the family or friends to take the body down off the cross. And so as the person died, horrible death, but the person died, his body was left on the cross to just decompose. And the animals and the birds and all destroyed the body, which was a double affront. You really needed to have a decent burial. And there's a lot of evidence, and they go through this to show that this was very prevalent not only in Judea, but throughout the Roman Empire when they crucified somebody. So the body was typically left on the cross till it just absolutely fell apart, which was a double injury. Not only did the person die a horrible death, but he could not be buried. Uh, but in this and in the others, uh, Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate, uh, and Pilate agrees that they can take the body down and bury Jesus. And so that's how Jesus gets buried in these stories. In Peter and in these other gospels, in various kinds of ways, his friends are allowed to take the body off the cross and bury him. The scholars say, unfortunately, that probably did not happen. It would be very unusual uh, for the Romans to allow a loved one to take the body off the cross. If Jesus was left on the cross, then that calls into question many aspects of the subsequent story of the burial and the resurrection and all like that. So that's one of the pieces of debate that has all kind of implications. I'm not equipped to debate that. I don't know that. I mean, I do know that it is a debate, but I'm not equipped to nor find it necessary to argue about that. I don't know. Uh, so Jesus dies. Joseph of Arimathea pulls the nails out of him. Uh, and they did nail. Sometimes the arms were tied to the crossbeam, but archaeology shows that the feet were in fact nailed to the cross, to the upright. So the arms may have been tied to the crossbeam, but the feet were nailed on the upright. Horrible, horrible, horrible way to die. Uh, It's a beautiful piece in here, very important piece that in all of the Gospels, all five of the Gospels here, Psalm 22 frames the the death of Jesus. That Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Comes from Psalm 22. Dividing the clothes and gambling for the clothes comes from Psalm 22. Uh, the abuse that the people made of Jesus on the cross echoes from Psalm 22. The debate then is, and it's a very significant debate, what is history and what is prophecy historicized? That history, Jesus died. There's no that's history remembered. The details of that in all of the Gospels, a lot of scholars attribute to prophecy historicized. It was very common in that era. If you wanted to prove a point, you were writing today, and you wanted to prove a point, you would go back into ancient writings and you would find a text, not a passage, but a text that would sort of reinforce what you were writing. It's called proof texting. Uh, so that is another whole debate. History remembered or prophecy historicized. And both Crossan and Dr. Brown, Raymond Brown, both in their own way, use those two parallels to describe the death of Jesus. Uh, Brown is more cautious in using the prophecy here historicized as a Catholic. They both are Catholic, but as a Catholic scholar than Crossan. But that's another fascinating point there. That you kind of pay your money, take a choice on that. I think really a lot of what we have in the Gospels is prophecy historicized. I have a different take on the death and all of that stuff with Jesus. That's different. So then, uh, in Mark's gospel, Jesus dies and is buried. They get him. They get him in a tomb there, uh, and then on Friday afternoon, he died on Friday afternoon. The women then go to the tomb in this is Mark's gospel. The women, Mary Magdalene and these others, very prominent figure, Mary Magdalene, go to the tomb early on Sunday morning, and the tomb is open, and Jesus's body is gone. The women do not see. The women in Mark do not see Jesus. In other gospels, Mary and these other, particularly Mary Magdalene, see Jesus in the other story. But in Mark, the women do not see Jesus. The body is gone. But either one or two men in white are in the tomb, are seated in the tomb. And they're the ones, when the women say, "Where is he?" One of these men in white says, "He is risen," like he told you, he is risen. Uh, and so the women look, and the tomb is empty. And the original Gospel of Mark ends right there. And the Bible, Mark says that the women said nothing and they left afraid. So Mark's Gospel ends with the women seeing the empty tomb. They were afraid, whatever the fear was, and they left afraid. So Mark's Gospel ends there. But unlike any of the other gospels, anything else that we have, the Gospel of Mark has three other endings. Along the way, people said, Lynn read the first one and he said, "That's not enough. We got to do better than that." So he writes another ending. And then we come along and I write an ending, and then you write an ending. And rather than the scholars in the fourth century deciding which is the real ending. They just included them all. So the Gospel of Mark has three endings. And the most unfortunate of those is the third ending, because it is in that ending that Mark allegedly, Mark didn't say it, but Mark allegedly says that if you really believe, have faith in Jesus, faith in God, you can drink poison and get bit by a snake and not die. So that's in the third ending there. And that's where this whole crazy thing of snake handling for the Baptist up in the boonies in the Appalachians in years gone by handle snakes. And the preacher could show that he could handle snake, let the snake bite him. He had faith that it wouldn't kill him, except sometimes he died. I mean, if he didn't have enough faith, he died. The states now, I know Georgia has passed a law that you can't handle snakes like that. But every now and then you hear some preacher, preaching and letting himself be bit by a rattlesnake or something, and he does die. Uh, and also in the Gospel of Peter, uh, when the women get there, and this is the Gospel of Peter, not in Mark, but in Peter, when they get, and it's not really the women, it's some of the men that get there. The tomb is open, and you get the idea that it's big. Lynn was saying that when he saw the Garden Tomb in Jerusalem, it was small, but you get the idea that it was real big. I don't know what it was. But when they got there, the tomb was open, and three men were coming out. Three men were coming out. Two of them were helping a third one come out of the tomb. So the two then you decide are angels, and the third is the risen, resurrected Jesus. He's the one, and they're helping him come out. And the way Peter tells it, suddenly these two men reach, they are suddenly, their bodies extend away up into the sky. This is the way it tells the two men. But the third in the middle there, the Jesus figure, his figure extends, they say, into the heavens. So this is the Gospel of Peter's way of talking about the resurrection of Jesus. He comes out, people see him, he comes out, and the figure of the third man, it doesn't really say Jesus, but you presume that it's Jesus, his figure reaches to the sky. Fascinating studies. I like what Crossan does to make it in the 40s, which means it would predate the Gospel of Mark by some few years. But win, lose, or draw, it is an ancient, ancient, ancient document, and it gives not a terrible picture of the death and the resurrection. There's not much about the death because it's such a fragmented piece, but the pieces of it, and it's very disjointed apparently from the way they work on it. But the governor, Etrarch, the governor, the royal governor, is the one that sentences Jesus to die, and not Pilate. Pilate is a friend, and then Joseph of Arimathea, like in the others, gets the body and buries the body. So these contrasts there, and that is to say that we have 27 letters, documents in the New Testament, in what I'm trying to call the Christian Testament. 27. There were thousands, literally thousands, of other stories, documents, theologies, and everything else being written in those first 300 years. Uh, in 1946, I've talked about this before. In 1946, an Egyptian farmer, we're back in Egypt again, an Egyptian farmer was working his field, and what they discovered was that some of these walls, they call them walls, along the river, along the Nile, with the coming and the going of the Nile and all through the millennia, these walls were rich fertilizer. And so the story is that an Egyptian farmer, totally illiterate, was chopping into a wall along beside the river to get to, it's going to be fertilizer for his field. And he chops in, and there inside, he chops into a big cave. And inside the cave is a big jug, a big brown earthen jug, big jug. And in that jug are scores and scores and scores of ancient documents uh, that has been called, as they call it now, the Nag Hammadi Library. Uh, Fascinating writings in there, uh, and shows many, many pieces there, but it shows how varied and rich and growing and changing and exciting and reaching out and everything else were those early 300 or 400 years of the Jesus movement. It was a very vibrant time of trying to figure out who they were as Jesus followers, as Jesus people. Uh, so we have, the phenomenal thing is out of all of those documents, the church fathers decided on 27, just 27 out of 1,000. Same thing with the Hebrew Bible. We have 39 books in the Hebrew Bible, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of other documents that are still around. The translations and all are still around that people read and study and all. But but history and church leaders and rabbis and people like that have decided that these 66 books is what we have in the Bible. Uh, Crossan is quick to point out nothing is going to change about the Bible. The Gospel of Peter is not going to become a part of the Christian Testament. But he says, I wish they had included more because there's so much more that they could have talked about. But what was happening as the movement developed, uh, men, not women, women were pushed aside. Men, many of whom were great thinkers and authorities and scholars and all, but these men gained control of the developing Jesus movement, of the developing church. And among them, no great organization, but among them, over a period of 200 or 300 years, a consensus grew that these 27 books would be the orthodox statement of the church. Uh, all kind of debates back and forth, blood, guts, fights. Uh, but finally, they decided that these 27 books. It is very interesting to realize that the list that we have, the 27 books that we have, was not finalized until about 380 or 90 by a group of bishops who got together at Hippo, a place called Hippo, and finally decided. Now, the 27 books had gradually become in use by the developing Jesus groups throughout the Mediterranean world. So they were, with a combination of use and leadership and authority and all of those kinds of pieces there, uh, these they agreed on the 27 books. The unfortunate thing that happened was they suppressed thousands and thousands of other documents, and especially they suppressed the writings and efforts of women. So that's it. So you have the Gospel of Peter. It could be from 40 CE or 120 CE, but at any rate, it is a very ancient statement of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And then you have the first one to make it into the 27, which is the Gospel of Mark. Uh, you read about that and you realize too that all of it's fun to me. Uh, that for a long time, Mark was not regarded as very important. And that's why when they did the listing, they made Matthew the first book. When in reality, even then they agreed that Mark was older, but it was not as important anyway. So along the way, though, by the what 18th, 19th, 17th, 18th centuries, uh, biblical scholarship had advanced enough for the scholars overwhelmingly to say that Mark is the oldest gospel. Uh, and it is also very clear, as we get into these others, that both Matthew and Luke had access to Mark's gospel and drew from Mark's gospel the broad outline of what they wrote in their gospel. The other big question is, where did Matthew and Luke get all the stuff that they put in their gospels that Mark did not include? And that's another whole story. Uh, but it is a very fascinating story here. Uh, and I think the heart of it is that those early Jesus people had come to know and love and appreciate and honor Jesus. And suddenly he was gone. Suddenly he was murdered, crucified. And my chief thing is particularly the Galilean villages where he had spent so much time refused to let him die. You know, he just we just can't let this man go. So even though they knew he died, they in their own mind and heart, they kept him alive. And gradually, the theology and the Christology grew up around him. Other people would vigorously disagree with that and say that from the very beginning, what we have in the Gospels is history. This is what Jesus said and did. Uh, I think it's different from that. I mean, in part, it is different from that. Well, that's a lot. Uh, I find it very fascinating and very and energizing, and uh, it doesn't. I mean,
It is fascinating.
huh?
It's really fascinating.
It is fascinating to see how it all came together, uh, and to let us know that we're not done yet. We are still trying to figure out in March of 2025 what it means to be a follower of Jesus. It's just as simple as that to me. I've got a little thing going that uh, it's not so complicated. Uh, if uh, this is Matthew 25, uh, if it looks like if it talks like this, if it well back up, if if Jesus if I try to talk like Jesus, live like Jesus, serve like Jesus, feel for other people like Jesus, accept the love of God like Jesus, I'm a Jesus person. All this other theology and all of it, you work with it, you can deal with it. Fine. I love to fool with it, I love to do it. But win, lose, and or draw, I'm a Jesus. I am not a perfect Jesus person, but this is he's my guy. You know, Jesus is my man. Jesus is my friend in any sense of the word. He is my savior. I try as I begin to do what I think he did, whatever to the abundant life. Mary Magdalene, in her ways, talked about uh, following Jesus leads one, in her languages, to full humanity. To follow Jesus, to get the vision and the follow of Jesus, is to live, it's to approach at least full humanity. And I like